Hello? Okay, back on my bullshit with the timer, because I'm gonna be an hour for this, because I know you're not gonna watch it if it's longer than an hour, and I don't even judge you for that. That's fine. This slide and this lecture is about eugenics, because how could I put together a disability policy course in the pandemic context without doing a lecture on coronavirus eugenic policies? It just seemed kind of obvious, and I feel like people would probably resent it if I avoided the topic. So it's here. So the title slide just says Postmodern Eugenics, and all that's really referencing, it's not referencing it in the literary context, it's just the, proliferation of eugenics in the absolute present, or postmodern era. And then I switched to time-checked breakdown. You know it, you love it. I didn't even put cozy space reminder this week because I know you're with me. I know you're vibing with me. I know you know what's going on. And if you don't, there's like 7 other lectures for that because I'm tired too. I get it. And and it being said that I'm tired too, you can tell it's late, because it is. I'm going over a little bit about that in the State of the Union update, because a lot of you filled out the wellness check-in too. I do read them. Please fill them out. I actually do read them, I promise. We're going to do 10 minutes about that, because I know I made some changes. The changes are for your benefit, but I still know it's confusing. We're going to do 30 minutes of all the eugenics readings. Can you feasibly explain how eugenics works in the postmodern era in 30 minutes or less? No. And that's why this lecture kind of sucks. But I'm going to try anyway, because why not, right? And any introduction is better than no introduction. But it should be said that we're straying pretty far outside of my own interest field for this one. Not to say eugenics isn't interesting, it's just not something I research. So, with that predicate, I did my best with it, okay? So I said we're going to do the text take-up, we're going to do key issues, and we're going to do key takeaways. This lecture assumes you've already read the material. I also posted on your Discord yesterday, if you didn't read the material for this lecture is not going to make a lot of sense to you, because I'm taking a lot of liberties in terms of what you already understand as a result of reading this article, okay? So then we're going to talk about the Writers' Workshop, which is this week's activity. I told you that also on the Discord. Then I'm going to talk about your right space for this week, and then I'm going to talk to you about next week, which is Aaron Soros's guest lecture. Very exciting. I'll tell you more about that this weekend when we record it. But I'm also talking to you about the read-around asynchronous activity. You know the read-around always comes after the workshop, so that's what's coming up for you. Okay? And both of those are team activities. So talk to me pretty much right this minute if you don't think that's happening for you this week, because that affects your team, and I need to figure that out. Okay? So pause this video, ping me, tell me what's going on. Or, if you think this is all going to be happening for you this week and next week, let's keep going, right? So I've gone to the next slide. It's a screen capture of your syllabus, and I've scribbled all over it. Week 8, which I made reading week 2, and we talked about that in our asynchronous class context. I removed all that content about coronavirus and higher education, because I feel like we kind of already did that with the Students Left Behind lecture, and if I'm choosing between my content and Jay's content, I'm gonna go with Jay's content every time, because he's just a better theorist. So, I feel like I did you a favor in this context. We're skipping coronavirus from my perspective, and we're going to coronavirus from a eugenicist perspective, which I think is very productive and very timely. So all of the scribbles on week 8 is all the content you no longer have to deal with. You can read it anyway. I can't stop you from reading that material. Hannah and Danielle's article is excellent on existing in the academy during coronavirus, and Margaret and Stephanie's methodology article, also excellent. Can't really fault that article. It's great. If you find yourself with free time, you can browse through it. I don't think a lot of people have free time right now, which is part of the reason why Reading Week 2 happened, right? The writing workshop, which I tried to indicate with a drawing of an arrow beside a squiggly line. I know it's a bad drawing. Please don't. Cats in the box. The writing workshop moves to this week, which is week 9. So all of the stuff you see there with the Contra podcast and the article and the public health review article, that coincides with writing workshop 2. And then the read around, which usually appears in week 9 with all of that article material, that also moves down 1 week to next week, week 10. So essentially what I've done is scribbled out everything from last week, took the workshop from last week and put it this week, and then took the read around from this week and put it next week. I hope that makes sense. And your syllabus has been updated to reflect these changes. And there's a very thorough announcement on the announcements channel. And I put an announcement update on the OWL channel, which gets sent to your email. So it is in a whole heck of a lot of places, all of these changes that have happened to our resilient syllabus. And I hope that they help you, because they helped me. As for the State of the Union, I explained to you that the workshop asynchronously is occurring this week. That is occurring exactly the same as how we laid it out in workshop 1, where you're taking the workshop worksheet, you're choosing a partner in your team, you're filling out the critical feedback for each other, and then you're using that information to edit your own write space, because that goes toward your portfolio, right? So you're kind of working on your exam right now a little bit, but you're doing it a little bit early, okay? And I'll go over the workshop requirements at the end of the lecture in approximately, wait for it, pause, 51 minutes, okay? This week you also have a write space. It's a creative entry. I know some of you like the creative entries better. Not every entry can be a creative entry because society is a cruel world, but this one is. So buckle up, get ready for that. This week you are handing in to the assignment OWL box the workshop worksheet, at least one, which you're also giving your partner in their team channel because they actually need the feedback you wrote, right? And you're handing in write space 7. And I will reiterate that weeks 9 to 12 all have a write space. So it is not favorable to fall behind in completing the write spaces if you can help it, because one is coming at you every Monday for the rest of the course run. But there's only 4 weeks left in the course run, so there's only 4 left, which is a positive, but as a negative, that's kind of a lot of work, right? I said at the bottom here, you can use the write space that you write this week, the Eugenics creative entry, as your workshop exercise if you finish it in time for someone else to actually edit it. So if you hand it in at Sunday at 6:30 p.m., probably don't use that one for your workshop exercise because you've given your partner approximately 6 hours to fill out their worksheet, right? And that's just, try to be a good person about it, right? Would you want 6 hours to fill out the workshop worksheet? If you answered no, probably don't do that to your team, okay? I'm hoping your team actually gets along with you and likes you as a person, etc. Because you're all really good people. I've met in quotations, most of you on the Discord, and you're all lovely. So be lovely to each other as well. I'm changing the slide. Now it says State of the Union workflow and capacity changes. I already went through this with you, so I'm going to try to be really quick about it. I know workflow looks different this month. I am aware that there are professors who are not honoring the fact that real life is a thing that is occurring in the current cultural zeitgeist. And though I can't do anything about that, what I can do is honor the fact that your workflow and work capacity looks different. And I invite you to tell me about that, or tell me what that looks like for you in your wellness check-in number 2. But you're not required to do that. If you want to use the wellness check-in 2 to tell me to go fuck myself and then do the activities and finish the course, I can't blame you for that. Honestly, I might be feeling like that if I was doing my undergraduate career in a pandemic as well. So I don't hate you for it. Maybe don't ruin my day with it, because I would be really sad to read it. But if it behooves you to do that, I can't stop you from doing that. The other thing I wanted to bring up, a lot of you are pinging me and messaging me, and you're super worried that you don't have a good enough reason to reach out to me. And I'd like to reiterate that you actually don't need a good reason to reach out to me. You don't even need like a bad reason to reach out to me. If you just feel like I'd really like to touch base with you about this course, that is a legitimate reason. Even if you just wanted to say, I'm thinking about this course today, that's a win for me. I think against all of the cultural context that's happening right now, if this course crossed your mind this week, that's pretty great. I would love to hear that. I'm always making time and making space for that, you know? And obviously I would love to just hear that you're okay, and I can make space for if you're not okay. That's all fine with me. So pinging me is not a sacred act. You can just do so, and I will reply within 24 hours. Okay? The only reason I won't reply is if I'm sleeping, or crying, or playing Pokemon Go. Oh no, what's it called? Pokemon Arceus. I apologize. Boundaries and abilities as dynamic structures. You've heard of dynamic disability. Now get ready for dynamic boundaries. Am I right? That just means, you know, the ways in which we construct and create workflow, or construct and create these goal structures we have in the academic context, move and change. And that movement and change is not evidence of failure, but rather your ability to look within yourself long enough to figure out, I have less capacity this week. Or, conversely, I have more capacity this week. And that kind of movement, or, you know, dynamism of boundaries is really healthy, and it shows that you're able to move beyond these hyper-structural ideations of how society would like you to be productive. So that is a long-winded way of saying, you know, if you're just not having it for a couple days or a week or 2 weeks, that is a dynamic structure that is allowed to happen. I would suggest you talk to me about it, and we can figure out a work plan for that. If that, you know, ability gauging is resulting in you not handing in anything else for the rest of the course, that's something you probably need to touch base with me about, but I am welcoming you to touch base with me about that. That is the most direct I can possibly be to tell you, please keep me in the loop. Okay? Okay. The only other things here, pardon me, it says 4 weeks left. You should be thinking about a capacity plan that finishes on a high note. I know a lot of you got rocked by midterms. I remember that. I'm not that old. And that sucks, and I'm here for that. But also, we have to plan how to move forward. And if you haven't already done the wellness check, please do so. I don't want to say it's required, but I'm also kind of telling you it's required. Okay? Awesome. So, what have I got? Eugenics and presentism. Okay. So Adobe Reader absolutely will not open up on my computer tonight for some reason. It's just having having a time with it. So I put here, use the external resource Sarah's notation of the Dolmage article. And I'm going to show you on an internet browser what that looks like because Adobe's not having it. So basically, in the Discord channel, I've given you a breakdown of how I go about notating articles. And I spoke to you a little about that in the Discord server. And basically why I did that was because a lot of you have applied to grad school and you are now asking me a ton of questions about how I do what I do, or what I don't do, or how I accomplish getting anything done. And the answer is I don't. Really, I get nothing done at any time. But in a reality where I do get things done, this is kind of how I go about it. And something that I think is really problematic is that I tell you to notate things or take notes during lectures, probably not these lectures, but other lectures with actually learned scholars. But we don't spend too much time in the kind of metacognitive exercise of thinking about how we do that. So I've gone through with this article because it's a more difficult article, and I've kind of thought through for you how I go about figuring out what's important and what I leave behind. And I hope that that is a reflective exercise for you. And in the case that it's not, I apologize. But for all the people who've been asking me lately about study skills and particularly notation, this is for you. So that document is uploaded. And if you haven't already read this article, you can do a kind of read along with me of it, which might help because this article's a lot more difficult than I remember it being. So I apologize for that. I have a couple notes here about why we notate at all, and you can pause and go through that if you want. But checking the time, I have to keep going. So here we go. If we're skipping to the eugenics part of the lesson, which is why we're all here, I said let's start with the disabled upon arrival article, the one where I said let's read it together, and I've notated it and told you where is what and what is happening and how certain things are breaking down. And I even noted here, I get it. This is a more difficult article than I remember it being, and I didn't... It's been a while since I've read this, and I remembered it being a little less accessible, and then I started reading it, and I was like, I probably wouldn't have assigned this if I read this word for word before I made this syllabus. But I love the challenge. I love that you're willing to attempt it with me. This article became what is a much more accessible book later. And I can't assign the book because there's just no way I can cover that in 30 minutes. I really can't even do this article in 30 minutes. So suffice to say, you know, this is what you've got, and we'll try to get through it together. So from the OED, Oxford English Dictionary, the kind of gold standard of dictionaries, I'm not going into that canon. Eugenics is, quote, a method of improving the human race. Eugenics was increasingly discredited as unscientific and racially biased during the 20th century, especially after the adoption of its doctrines by the Nazis. And for those of you who've already read this article, it makes a contention that the Americans actually, you know, went to huge lengths to perfect this system way before the Nazis did, which is an interesting kind of historical piece. But if I'm looking at kind of key takeaways, this is maybe what I wanted you to, you know, heavy air quotes, get from this. So, quote, and I'm reading verbatim from the slide here, which is verbatim quoting from the article. A heterotopia of deviation divides and isolates difference, suggesting that this situation of purifying by extraction is ideal for the, quote, normals in mainstream society, yet also creating a dystopian space for the minoritized. Ellis Island was just such a space. That's kind of the gist of what's going on. If we were painting a picture with incredibly broad strokes of this article, it's basically how does race and disability get constructed in the synecdoche of Ellis Island. And the synecdoche working there is Ellis Island is standing as a representation of immigration policy as it was, contravened by the Americans in the early 20th century. And then how that proliferated through to the 21st century is kind of the nexus that you come to at the end of the article. Okay? So second quote, at Ellis Island, which is the island with the Statue of Liberty, and they process all of American or all of, Eastern American immigration there. So that's like a hot spot of people who want to become American citizens, which is a really interesting kind of rhetorical relationship happening spatially, right? So to go back to the quote, at Ellis Island, the categories of defect and disability that adhere today were strongly grounded, if not created, as was the diagnostic gaze that allowed for the nebulous application of the stigma of disability. So I pulled that quote because I wanted to tie it back to what we were saying in week 4 and week 5 about the medical gaze, the medicalization of normalcy, the healthism complex that Shane Nielsen's going to talk about in 2 weeks, and we already spoke about, remember when we were talking about Peloton models? All of those things are part of the diagnostic gaze, wherein if we assign a bunch of medical terminology to things that we consider deviant or abnormal or reconstructed from a deviation from the norm, we can legitimize that difference through science, which we can then prove is pseudoscience. But that process of legitimization of why I'm objectively different from you is what this article is really concerned about, right? So if you take Ellis Island as this kind of flashpoint of construction of deviation or construction of difference, if I can prove that that's where difference was created, I can also therefore prove that's where normality is created, because we see difference and normality as a binary relationship. Okay, and I'll go back to that. So there's a third quote here as well. The insinuation of mental disability was conflated with a semiotics of exterior markers. In the heterotopia of deviation created at Ellis Island, undesirable bodies were shaded with attributions of disability, and disabled bodies were raised. And this is like a fuck you difficult quote to understand. And my frustration with assigning this article is that I found myself having to explain a lot of incredibly verbose paragraphs like this, and he doesn't write like this anymore. But what's basically happening here is that there's a lot of ties that you can make fairly readily between a physical racial relationship of disabling people. So when I'm trying to decide who gets voted off the island, who gets kicked off the island, you can point to a lot of physical markers, a lot of racial markers, the colors, the impediments, the missing body parts. Those are all fairly easy to identify. A secondary point that this article wants to make is that a far more suspicious paradigm created by Ellis Island was when it tried to deal with the differences that we can't readily identify. So things that we would think of as hidden disability, or undisclosed disability, or mental disability, something that might get called neurodiversity now, or passing, or masking, things like that. The people who were in charge of the immigration practices at Ellis Island were extremely concerned with the ways in which mental disability or neurodiversity or passing could infect the American normal population, right? So a lot of the article is concerned with the ways in which not only can you visibilize disability, but how you can invisibilize disability. And if you want to play that back, I really did try my best to give that a breakdown, but maybe I didn't have to go that far. I don't know. So let's just move on. So I've got here, and this is what I was trying to break down 5 seconds ago. There's a very distinct relationship drawn here between physical and racial debility mapping, and you're taking debility kind of prima facie here, insofar as you have to believe that these are disablements in order for this article to work. And as soon as you start interrogating whether or not those are disablements, this article becomes really complicated. And I'm aware that the racial fascination with this article already complicates that, but I think there's an argument there that some of the neurodiversities they're talking about are also undercomplicated in the context that they're being used in. All of that to say, I used debility here on purpose because this article takes it as a given that these assessors view it as debility, but also the American public would view it as debility. Okay? So a quote from Physical or Racial Debility Mapping. Admitting such aliens, not only do we increase the number of public charges by their inability to gain their bread, so productivity argument, but we admit likewise progenitors to this country whose offspring will reproduce, often in an exaggerated degree, the physical degeneracy of their parents. And that pulls on a lot of cultural myths that I'm sure you don't need me to break down for you. But, you know, the kind of core of that argument is they're going to be less productive. They're going to be a strain on our societal resources. They're going to be the people who are on ODSP, and we're paying for them and their family's existence. And we've already interrogated all the ways in which that's a complete lie. But that's what's going on there. So then there's mental debility mapping. And I put a quote here. The moron, designated as a high-functioning, feeble-minded individual, yet capable of passing as normal, being attractive to normals, highly sexualized, and thus an even greater menace to the gene pool, was a threat that created the need for greater diligence and surveillance. So that speaks to the point we were talking about a few seconds ago, where they were very fascinated with the ways in which people who were invisibly or non-disclosure disabled, I know I'm not supposed to use invisibly, I'm aware of that, were able to pass through these immigration checks because that would lead to infecting the population, right? So if you could detect all the ways that these morons or feeble-minded people or mentally disabled people or neurodiverse people were able to fool inspectors, you could create a purer gene pool. Is that logic we really want to break down? No. So I'll leave it at that. So I've created a kind of 5-second summary of one of the main points of this article, and I wrote, to create idealism or the American, like a prototypical American person, you first have to construct what you don't want the American to be. So when I ask you, draw an American, and you draw, Indiana Jones, why didn't you draw X or Y other person? Why did you draw someone that looked like Indiana Jones? Is the question that's being asked there. By creating these fail state constructions, or the ways in which people are deviant or abnormal, you can create a mythology of normalcy. So the argument that Jay is making is that we still subscribe to that mythology of normalcy. We still use a lot of those myths in how we interact with people in present day and assess them as like us, right? And here's where that mythology of normalcy was invented as a kind of meta-epistemic thesis about where we can derive that rhetoric, which is an interesting argument in itself. Is it terribly important to this class? No, but some of the points they're making about the mythology of normalcy, or the ways in which disability is created as a result of making this mythology of normalcy, is important to this class, right? Okay. So I said, not that we need to, but let's make it harder. So in order to invent normalcy, or invent the prototypical American, or what a baseline structure would be, given that there could be one, which I would argue you cannot create a baseline, you have to conversely invent deviance in order to make that normalcy. And that is not an argument unique to this article. That argument is endemic to CDS, right? In order to create deviance, you have to first, therefore, create its binaristic opposite, because that's how usually we conceive of that which is different. And I would argue even that is kind of a simplification, but let's take that to be true. In order to play with that binary, you must take it to be true that it is a binary, or that these states exist in total opposition. So in order to make this argument, I have to take it as true that there's normal, and then there's deviant, and there's a little bit of room in here, but I can pretty much see these two states as completely separate states, right? And I think in order to make the argument harder, and he does actually point this out, and I gave you a quote, that shows this has occurred to him, and he just chose not to deal with it in this article, that these are total binaristic opposites. So I think how we would make it harder is maybe saying something like, if you wanted to take someone feeble-minded and they look like Eva Gabor, so they're extremely sexually interesting and they're extremely charismatic and they're able to carry conversations and pass some of these checks that the immigration officials could use, you don't actually get to construct them as normal if you have an awareness that they are mentally ill, like schizophrenic or something. But you also don't get to construct them as entirely mentally ill or deviant because they are so able to pass as normal. So they've created this gray space state within these two states that technically you can't exist in for the purposes of this argument. And that invention of kind of subnormalcy kind of questions how we organize and direct deviance. So if I took just deviance, the right of this binary, I could probably create levels of deviance, where you have people with, I'm not even going to do it because it's not a productive exercise, but there's levels of deviance here, and there's probably levels of normalcy on this side. But it's taken for granted that you cannot also create a continuum in the middle here of people who will appear to us as scary or uncomfortable or different or challenging, and these people would not have a ready state in the synecdoche of Ellis Island. And that's how I'm trying to make it a little bit harder for you, okay? So he actually does see this, because there's a point in this article where he kind of gestures to that and then quickly moves on. So he says, in this new cartography, Ellis Island functioned to alter and remap the bodies of immigrants, if we're continuing this spatial metaphor. To figure out who was American, one had to scientifically create, locate, mark, and showcase the expulsion of he and she who were not. So you have to create the normals and the abnormals, right? And by creating one, we've created the other, even if we don't intend to. Thus, Ellis Island as a rhetorical space was a conduit or centrifuge through which race and defect could be redefined. The binary, right there. Ellis Island offered a page, not a blank page, but an available surface upon which racial others could be newly mapped, always located offshore from the American ideal. Okay, and I don't have any more time, but that's kind of how we're going to complicate the argument. So then I'm going to move on to Laura Appelman's article from last year that she did for Harvard Public Health Review. And she wrote about this huge history of American eugenics that you can use for your Right Space article, and how that history continues to reify itself within the context of COVID-19. So this is a really long article. I think it's worth reading, but if you want to, skim through and grab, like, okay, there was the 1920s, there was the 1950s, there was the 1980s, here's how it's playing out in the present, that's fine. And I've generated some kind of best of quotations for you. So, quote, "Our COVID-19 policies have helped reinforce this philosophy of eugenic practice by creating a literal underclass of the unfit and unvalued whose lives are treated as less valuable. Our eugenics-based approach to the pandemic is a reflection of our long-held but little discussed eugenics beliefs established in the late 19th century and still endemic today." So while Jay's article was talking about the kind of bringing into existence of these eugenicist policies in the American context, Laura Appelman kind of takes this concept and attempts to map it throughout the 19th century. So you get a kind of extensive timeline of all the ways in which we've been really shitty to each other, through a kind of pseudoscience and biology of who we should treat differently because of the fact that they're different. Okay? So, quote, "The very existence of these unfit individuals posed a threat because they would not only cost money to support," myth, "but also might spread their degenerate hereditary traits through reproduction, thus weakening the American stock." And that's kind of like an iconic myth of eugenics, where if you have ruined biology, you will pass on that ruined biology and begin to ruin your kind, right? So, quote, "What has been called the second wave of eugenics," and this is toward the end of World War II, "still relied heavily on sterilization initiatives following World War II. Okay, she actually says it. This sub rosa continuation of eugenic principles and philosophy included policy organizations like Birthright, the renamed Sterilization League of New Jersey espousing sterilization, racial discrimination, and carefully selected human breeding in 1943. And if you want to make the argument it was a lot worse in America, I'm here to upset you because it's not. It's just as bad in Canada. But I don't have time to go over all the ways in which it was bad in Canada, and I'm sure, based on the fact that most of you are fourth years, you have gone over in great detail the many, many ways in which Canada also has to answer for this. Okay? So a couple more key quotes from Laura Appelman's article. Quote, "It is unsurprising then that medical practices based on scientific eugenic beliefs have continued well into the 21st century. Repeated sterilizations performed on incarcerated women in the California prison systems, for example, continued until roughly 2010. I would have been surprised if I read the number 1910, because that seems a bit late, but that number is 100 years later, right? So that's a moment that should shock you as an academic that I am signposting for you at this moment. Both federal and state governments simply failed to provide proper PPE and sanitation supplies to nursing homes, long-term care homes, and institutions for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. putting numerous high-risk individuals in jeopardy. We did this a little bit in week 5, where we were talking about the ways in which coronavirus policies are leaving some people behind, right? So she's just going further and talking about some actual healthcare policies that very intentionally left some people behind. So, quote, a few states have experimented on patients by trying unproven COVID-19 treatments on nursing home residents without consent. That follows a long history of experimenting on people nobody cares about in the American context, also proliferating through the Canadian context. Quote, long-term adult care facilities have been notoriously deadly hubs during the pandemic. Approximately 40% of all COVID-19 deaths in the United States have been linked to nursing homes. That number is shockingly huge, right? So that, you have to go a little bit beyond, I think this virus is targeting nursing homes, to the suggestion I was making in the schizophrenia and COVID lecture that it's not actually the virus targeting nursing homes, it's us targeting the nursing homes, right? We are choosing in a tertiary way who is okay to leave behind, right? And that, it's a short jump from choosing to triage people to full-on eugenics. It's actually the same thing. That Venn diagram is a singular circle, right? So, quote, finally, when COVID-19 cases threatened to skyrocket in the early weeks of the pandemic, many states implemented ventilator and ICU bed rationing plans, either prioritizing non-disabled patients or generally excluding a variety of patients with certain disabilities or above a certain age. Read Eugenics. States backed off such rationing plans when numbers improved over the summer, but once case counts began rising in the late fall and winter, many began planning rationing protocols once again. And what can we sub in for the words rationing protocols, or tertiary care, or triage assessment? All of those words mean another word, right? Okay, I know I'm really, boring you with this, but we're almost done. So now we switch to, we have the Dolmage article from 2011, and then we went to 2021 with Laura Appelman, and now we're doing, I think it's still 2021, I think that was last year. If you look 12 years after that article was published, that author, Jay, then spoke to another CDS scholar kind of about the eugenic legacy that happened not only, since 2011 or, even 1911, but since the kickoff of coronavirus, right? And I wanted you to see that just because I think it's kind of unfair to give an article that's 11 years old and then say, now apply that to COVID, because he's actually done that himself. So that was the original, and then you'll see the update. And it also gives you kind of a more nuanced interpretation of how this plays out in the modern context. So here's the quotes that, I wanted you to pick up on, but if other things resonated with you, I'm not trying to quote police you. These are just the ones I picked up for you, okay? So quote, this one's from Jay. I think all of them are from Jay. No, I think one's from Amy. I lied to you. I'm sorry. This one's from Jay. People are dying, obviously, and I think that there are actually, in some cases, eugenic intentions behind some of the policies that are being created. And that's what Laura Appelman was just going over in the last couple quotes, right? With the PPE assignments and the ways in which we're assigning ventilators. That's what he's talking about there. Quote, there is also a kind of passive eugenics that's happening around the ways that people value different lives. And that's a bigger argument that gestures toward what we were talking about earlier, okay? And at the same time, there are affordances that are being made for people. So the ways in which accessibility entered the modern cultural context. So, it's this very strange situation where, there's increased access to a lot of things, and at the same time, there are these unbelievably scary threats at the same time. And this is something that Hannah and Danielle picked up on in their Disrupture article. that at the same time we're creating all of these new and exciting ways to preface accessibility in everything we do, we're also going pretty ironically out of our way to make things like healthcare or basic human rights inaccessible. So while we're rewarding ourselves on this hand for how newly accessible we are by building ramps and including, auto-generated closed captioning, we're also disproportionately killing people with mental illness and people that live in nursing homes of a disease that we've ostensibly cured. So, before you go around rewarding yourself for all of the accessibility that you've implemented, I think they're kind of asking if you're backgrounding that in a context of eugenics, how accessible are you really, right? So I'll give you another one. That's gotta be Jay. Okay, quote. And we had, these things sort of spread out. And instead of being based at Ellis Island, so that's very directly talking about the article that we read, that then became a book, a lot of these things began to be based at the American-Mexican border, which you'll remember when we were at the end of the article, we were pointing out all the ways in which it was happening beyond Ellis Island, to places like Guantanamo Bay or places like the Mexican border. It starts to spread to these other points of entry, right? And we went from this control in particular locations like Ellis Island to this remote control. They picked up at the border and sort of laid it down all across the country, and I think those eugenic ideas still very much structure so much of what we do. And it's upsetting to admit that, and it's not something people want to admit, but it's so important right now to name eugenics when we see it. And so, what we're seeing right now in kind of racism against Asian Americans, this was last year, it's what we're seeing right now in some of the newer stories coming out around race and COVID. It's so imbricated in the healthcare system, the idea of triage in which bodies are valuable. So that's picking up fairly directly on some of the issues that Laura Appelman was pointing out in her article about the ways in which healthcare is implicitly valuing some people over other people. So you can take the idea of triage, you can take the idea of rationing, you can take even the idea of some countries saying who's not allowed to be vaccinated. There was a South Asian country that banned mentally ill people from getting vaccines. That's, fairly overt, right? And all of those things, when taken in this macro context, start to construct whose lives are worth saving. And the answer, in huge quotes, to whose lives are worth saving are normal people. And if you're deviant from that idea or that ideal of normal, you are therefore not worth saving. Right? Okay. I think I have one more quote, and then we're going to move on to instructions. And this is also Jay. So when Amy asks him, if you have one takeaway from this new era of eugenics, tough question, what would that be? He says, by calling these things eugenics when we see them. So when we were saying, triage, or when we were saying immigration policies, or when we were saying, ways which people get saved, or who's allowed, all of those words that are supposed to kind of imply eugenicist policies, his argument is, why don't we just straight up call it eugenics? And if you've been following along in the CDS scene, people are more than happy to do that in 2021 and 2022. This has happened in a big way. Okay? You literally cannot get away from this word. Quote, the truth. There will be a lot of apologies, right? There will be a lot of people saying, no, that's not what I'm trying to do, no, that's not what I'm trying to say, I'm just trying to explore this scenario, or I'm just trying to talk this through, or think this through. And that's how eugenics works. Eugenics is really most powerful as an idea, and it's really contagious as an idea. And I don't even have a way to expand on that quote. That quote's just brilliant. Well said. Well done. That's why he's, a tenured scholar and I'm not, right? So, with my last 10 minutes, perfect, I'm going to tell you about Writer's Workshop 2. I'm going to tell you about the prompt, and I'm going to tell you about next week. Here we go. And if you need to pause to read the instructions, you can do that. I can't tell. It's all fine. I said Writer's Workshop 2. We're doing it again. Take any completed write space except the one you used in the first Writer's Workshop. So if you use number 1, 2, or 3 in the first workshop, you may not choose that one again. So if you chose 2, you're not using 2 for Writer's Workshop 2. Okay? You can use this week's write space if you can send it to them before 4 hours before the deadline. Okay? So you can use it, but be fair about it. Use the workshop worksheet from the classroom server. It is the exact same worksheet as last time because you're asking them all the same questions. I want about 350, 400 words for this, so you do need to answer with more than one sentence. But if you've written a paragraph, you've also gone too far, okay? Of critical commentary. And critical doesn't mean be mean. So I wrote here as a bullet point, all the regular rules of being a good person apply here. Critical commentary is different from blatantly mean commentary. Please don't do that. There's no good reason to do that. Be fair and be empathetic about what you're saying to your partner because we're all good people here, right? I said, please try and upload it back to your team server. Example, the Quokka's private server or the Snake's private server before Sunday. And that's because next week we're doing the read around. So if you guys all finish your edits before Sunday, you are freed up to edit and record your video next week. Okay? If you're running behind, please let your partner know before you ping me. They need to know that way before I do, right? So it would be nice if you pinged me to let me know that you and your partner have worked something out, but you absolutely need to ping them because this is a team activity, right? Your partner needs this feedback more than I do. You will take this feedback to edit your entry for, wait for it, the second read around. And I'm so excited that we're going to do this again because I really love cheerleading exercises. I think we don't do enough to try to get people to just straight up encourage each other. I don't think everything has to be a critical commentary exercise. I think you've given people critical commentary, and now we can just celebrate what we learned and what we've done, right? So next week, we're all celebrating each other. So as your teams, we're going to do the same thing. It'll play out exactly like Read Around 1. When you've edited that write space, and you should have OWL feedback from me about that, record a short video of you reading the material. You do not have to appear in the video. No one you know has to appear in the video. If it is against, an image of a peep, those marshmallow candies. Hi, Domino. That's totally fine with me. It's Easter next month, right? So you can record it to an image of peeps or whatever. Please don't feel pressured to appear in the video. But otherwise, this is your creative space. I don't care how you do it. If you can caption it or use that TikTok bullshit, I'm too old for that. That would be awesome. I don't know. I don't have any instructions for you for that, but figure it out. Many students, for the last read around, uploaded to private YouTube channels, and you can share those private links without making those videos public. So you're not advertising to all of YouTube your creative fascination with disability, though I think that would be cool. You don't have to do that. You can upload totally privately. So then I have Write Space 7 instructions, and you can pause this, and this will also appear on OWL under your assignment instructions. It says, Appelman's article does an extremely thorough, Domino's standing right in front of the screen. Presentist history of eugenics playing out in real time in coronavirus in the American context. Jay and Amy have a conversation in the Contra podcast about how these deviance control mechanisms play out in the Canadian context, right? So you are going to choose either the American or Canadian context. Please do not try to do a mashup. They are different countries. Write a short narrative about a fictional being which can be loosely based on whoever you want, that is multiply marginalized by current eugenicist frameworks occurring in coronavirus. You can choose whether this story temporally occurs in 2020, 2021, or 2022. But depending on what year you choose, your policies have to match that year. So don't write about 2020 and use 2022 policies. Okay? You have to actually get that right. And I lived through it, so I will know. You know, it's easy to look up. Oh my goodness. Why are you doing this? This prompt should take you about 800 to 1200 words. If you're using Microsoft Word, that's about a page and a half. And it's due Sunday at midnight. If you don't get it done this Sunday, there's no late policy in this class, but I will remind you that all 4 of our last 4 weeks have a write space. So if you don't get it done this week, you're writing 2 write spaces next week. And I designed this course that you only do a little bit of writing every week. Thank you. Instead of a lot of writing some weeks. So I'm hoping you can find time to get it done this week. But if you don't, that's okay. You can figure it out on your own terms. Okay? So here's the slide that Domino included for us. Thank you, Domino. And here's the slide for if you'd like to contact me directly. That is mostly for community, but it's also for you, just in case. How am I doing for time? I've got 2 minutes left. Amazing. I'm getting better, guys. We're almost done this course, but I've finally perfected is a strong word, being under an hour. I'm going to get this up for you tonight. I'm going to play with my cats, and I will see you next week. All right, take care.